More than half of a century ago, Adolf Hitler set out to invade all of Europe. It was a time of great uncertainty, of fear and trepidation, as people around the world watched in horror as the Nazis marched across Europe, leaving death and destruction in their wake. Today, we find ourselves facing a new threat, one that is just as ominous and just as dangerous as the one that Hitler posed so many years ago. For the first time since World War II, Europe is on the brink of another war. A war that has potential to be just as devastating as one that ravaged the continent so many years ago. The conflict that is currently raging in Ukraine has far-reaching consequences that go beyond the borders of that country. Although the fighting is taking place on Ukrainian soil, the side effects of this full-blown war are being felt all over the world. What started as a war between Russia and Ukraine over security, ethnic, and economic interests has turned into a structure that we witnessed and knew during the Cold War period. The Ukrainian war is not only at the level of the European strategic stage with its forces reflections, current and possible extensions, but it has also become the main conflict of our time. The reflections of this war, both at the economic and social level, at the security and political level, have greatly affected countries. In the midst of the ongoing military tension, the current activity on the sides of the conflict, and the lack of a solution in the foreseeable future, the relations between NATO and Russia have escalated badly. The main crisis point of this conflict was the seas. Both the Mediterranean and the high seas have become crisis points for the Russian Navy and NATO naval vessels. At this point, the crisis experienced by the Russian Navy in the international seas, which was faced with heavy destruction in the Black Sea, is progressing on a much more critical course. The Kremlin is certainly not on the side of causing a crisis, because they have a clear front on which they are fighting. However, they also want to make the Russian threat felt. NATO's responses to this threat are always on the table. On the other hand, NATO defines some of the Kremlin's moves as unprofessional and professionally eliminates the current crisis possibilities. What happened in the Mediterranean and the Black Sea the other day was the professional behavior of NATO against the phenomenon that the Russians wanted to feel. The Russian Navy's high-altitude patrol boat, Sentinella, intercepted 2 Russian ships in the western Mediterranean on Tuesday and began tracking and tracing, according to a report from the Spanish Defense Staff, IMAD, under the Spanish Ministry of Defense. 2 Russian ships were designated as the Admiral Casatano frigate and the Academic Passion tanker. According to IMAD Sentinella, it is now integrated into the permanent operations framework of the Spanish Armed Forces, where it conducts surveillance and security missions in the waters off the southern coast of Spain. Its primary purpose is to protect national interests in Spanish sovereign waters. A ship reportedly carrying military supplies and equipment from Russia was seen crossing the Black Sea recently. The report says that the Russian ships, as part of 4, slipped silently into the sea with supplies before heading for the port of Nova Assist, possibly providing ammunition for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Against the increasing presence of the Russian Navy in the Mediterranean, 3 NATO aircraft carriers are traveling in the Mediterranean as a message to Russia. In the second year of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is not slowing down when it comes to displays of deterrence against potential adversaries. 3 NATO carriers from the United States, Italy, and Spain are conducting multi-carrier operations in the Mediterranean as part of the planned deployment of the USS George H.W. Bush aircraft carrier strike group to the U.S. Navy Europe operations area. NATO will operate in close coordination with support troops from Greece, Turkey, Croatia, Hungary, the Netherlands, and Albania. It is also clear that the buildup of Russian ships in the Mediterranean increases the risk of an incident. Russian Navy ships crossed the Mediterranean in numbers unseen even in the Cold War, posing the risk of an incident with NATO forces in the normally stable region. We can say that this increase coincides with an aggressive attitude similar to the stance of Russian naval forces in the Baltic Sea. Many experts have expressed the opinion that the approach of the Russian frigate Admiral Gorshkov, armed with hypersonic missiles to the central Mediterranean after the exercises in the southern Mediterranean, may worsen the already complex and turbulent situation. It would be wrong to say that Admiral Gorshkov would make such a contrary move. However, it will not hold back from maintaining elbow contact. The Allies have repeatedly affirmed the right of all nations to cross international waters peacefully. US officials had previously said that interactions with the Russian Navy occur with a certain frequency and are generally safe. However, to understand what it might cost for a Russian ship to encounter the George H.W. Bush aircraft carrier strike group in the Mediterranean after this time, we need to examine this issue well. In other news, Russia's Ministry of Defense confirmed that 6 amphibious warships that left the Baltic Sea this week are on their way to the Mediterranean, where they say they will participate in naval exercises. This amphibious fleet can swing north from the Mediterranean towards the Black Sea. There is already considerable debate among experts and observers over whether these ships will be the true final destination, which will put the ships in Ukraine in a position to support a possible new large-scale Russian intervention. At the end of March, separately, the Russian Navy's Vishna-class intelligence collection vessel, Vasily Tatishev, was spotted crossing the Strait of Gibraltar in the Mediterranean. It is unclear where the ship went, but it is possible that her appearance was somehow related to these other Russian naval movements. Russia said that naval exercises in the Mediterranean will be part of a wide array of naval exercises around the world, including the North Atlantic and Pacific regions, which will involve a total of about 140 ships and 60 aircrafts. In the statement made by the Russian Ministry of Defense, it is stated that the purpose of the exercise is a naval and air force exercise to protect Russia's international interest in the world's oceans and to encounter military threats to the Russian Federation. The language used by the Russian Defense Ministry to describe these naval exercises is, in many ways, similar to the way that the Kremlin describes the nature of large-scale exercises in Belarus, scheduled to begin next month. The massive deployment of troops and supplies, including standard short-range ballistic missiles and warplanes associated with these exercises, has raised concerns from officials in Ukraine, the United States, and elsewhere. The fear is that all of this may be a cover to put these forces in a position for an anticipated new Ukrainian offensive. On the other hand, NATO, by being cautious about Russia's attack, tried to prevent the possibility of a conflict between the Allies and Russia for a while. In fact, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg stated that NATO is a defensive alliance after the NATO summit, which was held the day after the attack began. He declared that they were not seeking conflict with Russia and that they would not be involved in Russo-Ukrainian war. However, NATO emphasized that all kinds of military, financial, and humanitarian support will be given to Ukraine against Russia, and now it is trying to continue its support by keeping its promise, stating that political and practical support will be increased for Ukraine, which is on the defensive against the Russian invasion, and that support will be continued to help Ukraine win. NATO underlines that Russia is fully responsible for this war, which is a clear violation of international law and the UN Convention. He stresses that efforts will continue to be made for peace, security, and stability throughout the NATO region. The US and NATO allies are trying to take a stance that emphasizes unity against Russia's invasion of Ukraine. They are trying to make Russia pay for this invasion. First, they imposed heavy economic sanctions against Russia. Now, they are supplying the Ukrainians with weapons to fight against the Russian invasion and empowering NATO countries to make it clear that they will resist any invasion from Russia. NATO aims to continue increasingly all kinds of military, financial, and humanitarian support to the Ukraine this year. Naturally, this indicates that it will be a year when tensions with Russia will be high. As a result, although this war was ostensibly referred to as the Russian-Ukrainian War, it turned into a war in which Ukraine found itself and had no influence on its results. Despite the fact that the cost paid by all parties have increased in direct proportion to the continuation of the war, the scenario has become the only realistic solution. Unfortunately, it does not seem possible to reach this last scenario in the short term. Considering all of this war may expand further and may have different reflections on us in the form of a frontal war. In other words, although this war is an ending war for Ukraine, we can also say that it is the beginning of war for the Western world. The Western world is trying to take a strong position against Russia every day and tries to prepare its relations with Russia according to a definite but undetermined result. It is essential to recognize the gravity of the situation and act accordingly. The current situation has a severe impact on the global community, not just the nations directly involved. The conflict in Ukraine is no longer just about the security and interests of Ukraine, but it has become a significant concern for the entire international community. The escalation of the conflict poses a threat to the stability of the region and the world. The world leaders must come together to find a solution to this conflict. The current situation demands a diplomatic and peaceful resolution to avoid further escalation of the conflict. The international community must recognize the severity of the situation and act accordingly. In conclusion, the Ukrainian conflict is a critical issue that requires immediate attention from the international community. The world leaders must come together to find a peaceful resolution to this conflict. The escalation of the conflict will have far-reaching consequences, and it is essential to avoid any further escalation. The Ukrainian conflict is not just about the security and interests of the Ukraine, but it is a significant concern for the entire international community. We must act now to ensure peace, security, and stability in the region and the world.